thousands upon thousands of emails and letters every year from people saying, weeds are ruining my life.
Inside of these plant communities. Plant invasion is one of the highest ranked threats to biodiversity in Australia, as it is a major source of pressure to these plant communities. This here is a narrow leaf cotton bush, and it is one of Australia's many invasive weeds.
An invasive species is a species occurring usually due to human activities beyond its accepted normal distribution and which threatens valued environmental, agricultural or other social resources by the damages it causes. In natural ecosystems, invasive plants impact negatively on the biodiversity of many Australian vegetation types, and many infest large areas of the continent. Throughout history, over 27,000 non-native plant species have been introduced to Australia, and from this number, around 2,700 non-native plants have become naturalised in Australia. These naturalised species now pose a serious threat to biodiversity, not only in reference to particularly rare or threatened species, but also in relation to animal communities and ecosystem processes. The issues of invasive species affects many different groups of people, from your average Joe weeding in their backyard to farmers having to deal with large-scale invasive weed species. The gardening industry is the largest importer of introduced plant species, being the cause for the introduction of 94% of new plant species into Australia. Of the 2,700 introduced plant species now known to be established in the Australian environment, 66% are escaped garden plant species.
In Australia, there are several categories of invasive species of weeds. Environmental weeds are naturalised plant species that have invaded native vegetation.
Noxious plants are formally declared weed that implies the need for active management to reduce the negative impact of the plant species on human activities. Other categories include the alert list species, weeds of national significance, and garden thugs. A group of scientists have been able to identify the stages or categories of plant invasion with numbers of species known for Australia. Although plant invasion is a continuous process, scientists have been able to identify at least 3 distinct stages of invasion. The introduction stage commences with the arrival of a new species to a region. Introduction may occur either accidentally or for ornamental value. Some species introduced may spread from where they are planted and become established permanently in their new environment, or they may fail to reproduce and disappear. The plant species that are able to reproduce naturally without cultivation enter the naturalisation stage. Alternatively, some of the naturalised flora will spread exponentially and enter the invasive stage. The invasive plants that interfere in some way with human activity are then termed as weeds. The time from the introduction stage to its naturalisation stage may vary greatly. The impacts of invasive plant species on Australian biodiversity that have been studied show that they are currently or potentially great. These impacts that invasive species pose include the survival of their native plant competitors, the distribution and abundance of species, but also the structure and function of Australian ecosystems.
The impact of weed competition is the primary source of extinction of at least 4 native plant species.
Research has shown that there are 41 listed cases in which a native Australian plant species has been threatened by a single or multiple weed species. Certain communities can be drastically altered by a single non-native species so that the biodiversity of these communities found in harsher environments may be threatened if it is invaded by a species that has become well adapted to that particular environment. Invasive species alter the environment by disturbing the ecosystem functions and creating competition for native species. The abundance of a weed is dependent in the first instance of its capacity to obtain basic resources such as light, water, and nutrients. An example of the competition created by invasive species is a community that consists mainly of small trees and shrubs, then the non-native plant species would invade by dominating the overstory. These changes in resource availability for one species or a higher taxon will have repercussions through the food web. Introduced plants can also change the entire ecosystem by modifying water or nutrient regimes. These changes to the structure of the environment and the composition of vegetation affects the availability of resources. The resources that are available within the habitat and the spatial patterning of the recourse can be drastically altered when a non-native plant species invades. Invasive species also alter the biodiversity of communities, as a particular alien species may enhance habitat suitability for some species but degrade it for others due to their different resource requirements. There are many different species of weeds in Australia that outcompete our native neighbours, but the most commonly known weed in Australia at the moment is lantana. So lantana forms dense thickets that smother our native vegetation. As you can see here, this lantana formed a huge area that's taken over this understory. Lantana was originally a garden plant, yet it is still available for sale after being a weed of significance to our grazing industries of Australia. Weeds can influence crop and pasture ecosystems in many ways. The crop systems themselves largely consist of introduced plants, as few native plants other than macadamia have been domesticated. Weed presence is associated directly with the reduction of crops and product contamination. There have been cases of some weeds poisoning animals or leading to poor animal performance as well. Consideration of these impacts of weeds on ecosystem is made more complex by the fact that the same species may affect both natural and agricultural ecosystems. The negative impact of introduced weeds in natural ecosystems are expressed in terms of decreases in biodiversity, whereas the negative impacts of weed in agricultural ecosystems are mainly expressed in terms of increased costs to producers and consumers. Plant invasion now has a major impact on our economy. The Brisbane City Council spends over $5 million on weed management, as Brisbane now hosts over 400 invasive weed species. The WWF have created several future recommendations to lessen the overall impact of invasive plant species. Many of these recommendations consist of prohibiting the sale of plant species that are weeds of national significance and increasing the awareness of the Australian community to the negative impacts of weeds. The WWF believe that if the number of invasive garden plants known to be naturalised and available for sale here in Australia can be decreased, then the impact of future weeds impacting our Australian ecosystems can also be decreased.